This is part 2 of The Last Command. Listen to part 1 if you haven't already. Luke and company arrive at Wayland. When they approach the planet, Han notices suspicious readings on the Falcon's sensors, but is unable to identify anything specific. They land near Mount Tantus and plan on traveling via speeder bike, but are attacked by predators that are drawn to the bike's electronic signatures, and forced to walk instead on what will be a 2-week journey. During the trek, Mara asks Luke how the Emperor really died. As they travel, Han notices that they are not encountering more predators and notices some dead birds with knife wounds. Luke and Mara detect aliens approaching, but they leave before getting too close. Mara agrees to Force instruction as they travel, despite Palpatine's orders to kill Luke still blaring in her head. Eventually, they encounter a group of Nogri who had been sent by Leia to keep them safe. The Nogri bring them to meet some natives who agree to help attack Mount Tantus after discovering that Chewbacca is a comrade rather than a slave. C'baoth mind controls Imperial General Kaval, who flies him to Wayland. He detects Luke and Mara on the way in and predicts that Mara will soon bow to him and Luke will follow. Luke and Mara also detect C'baoth, but decide to continue forward regardless. Thrawn finds out that Kaval died in his sleep after behaving strangely and giving out secret orders, and hypothesizes that C'baoth's control overloaded his brain. Thrawn confronts C'baoth over HoloNet, but C'baoth ignores him and complains about the Ysalamiri in the facility blocking his powers. Thrawn orders the commanding officer at Mount Tantus to confine C'baoth to the throne room and to not let any of the troops that received orders from C'baoth or Kaval back into the mountain.
All right, so the gang arrives at Wayland, and there's these animals that are down on the planet that can basically sense repulsor lifts. They can sense repulsor lifts, and basically they can tell when like a ship is flying around. And it immediately reminded me that in Bad Batch, which also takes place on Wayland at Mount Tantus, the Imperials in that show employ these animals called Lurka hounds. I don't remember if they can sense repulsor lifts or not, but basically it's like they capture and then release these like dog things into the woods, and that prevents people from sneaking in. So I thought that was interesting. But I will say Zahn really has this thing about animals having very specific talents. Like, okay, the Vronskers can sense the Force. Very conveniently, all these species exist that can sense and detect all of the things that would make, completing their mission way more trivial with a speeder bike and a Jedi. But on the other hand, there's like billions of species in the galaxies, and eventually you're bound to find one and you can domesticate them, I guess. But
yeah, it is something you don't actually see in the original trilogy. Like, there are creatures, but they're all just like, they'll eat you. And that's the one common thing between like the Wampas and the Rancors and Sarlacc and the giant worm in space. Like, there's nothing that unique. They're just big animals that, eat you.
Yeah, and it got me thinking, because Card kind of starts pondering, like, are the Vronskers the only animal in the galaxy that can hunt with the Force? And I don't know. I guess my conception coming into this is that most animals in Star Wars have some kind of connection to the Force. Maybe that's just I'm imagining it because so often in these books and shows, a Jedi will use the Force to kind of commune with an animal, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're like Force sensitive.
So Mara is shown here to actually have a better danger sense than Luke, and she's able to detect the intruders or detect something out in the woods before Luke can. Though Luke is actually able to pinpoint how many and can teach her to distinguish between different thought patterns, much to her annoyance. But we find out Luke can tell whether a mind is human or not, but can't distinguish between any non-humans. They're all just non-humans in his Force book, which is interesting.
Yeah, so throughout this whole section, Luke is kind of mentoring Mara on the Force, and he starts thinking about what he's going to do when the twins are born, and, how do I teach them about the responsibility that comes with the power of the Force? In other words, Uncle Ben's great power, great responsibility speech. This happens in The Force Awakens with Kylo Ren. Like, the answer is he does a bad job, I guess. Like,
Luke kind of skirts around the whole Vader thing and doesn't mention his whole deal directly. But they turn to the topic of C'baoth, and Mara's, pretty afraid of actually having to confront him. But Luke accepts that this is just something they have to do in the same way that he had to confront Vader and makes some allusions to some vague Force visions he had of Mara meeting her destiny in Mount Tantus. And that was something that was big in Return of the Jedi, that, Yoda and Vader both sort of keep referencing, like, this is part of Luke's destiny, that he has to overcome this trial or something. And Luke views Mara being part of this as like her version of it.
Yeah, he gets a little wise in this scene. I think this scene really stood out to me, where he becomes a bit more of the mentor and a bit more of the kind of Obi-Wan, or his Obi-Wan-ness starts showing. And this is what I wanted to see more from him. He doesn't have to be Confucius in terms of dropping hard facts every sentence, but a little bit of nuggets of wisdom here and there is appreciated. And it was nice to see him in a role where he's kind of helping somebody else fulfill their destiny. And I think it's just so much of these previous books has been spent kind of retreading character beats that he's already gone through in the movies. And I'm just like really looking forward to see him growing into sort of this wise Jedi master.
Yeah, this is definitely sort of an indication of growth and evolution from where he was in Return of the Jedi. Given that it's been 5 years or whatever, you'd hope to see some more of that. But yeah, I mean, he's talking about, this big destiny that he and Mara have to face, which at the time, he had his confrontation with Vader, and now he has this, so it's a big occasion. But with dozens and dozens of more books coming out, Luke ends up facing his destiny every 6 weeks. Yeah. So it stops sort of becoming this like special thing. So Luke does some Force training with Mara, makes his own version of the block the remote with the lightsaber thing, and he's floating some seed pods they found around and having her try to, slice them up. And his only advice here is just let the Force flow through you, which I know Yoda told him, but he really doesn't have any additional instructions for Mara here. She keeps failing until she finally decides to just stop the pod midair with the Force herself and stab it. And she thinks that Luke is going to get all mad because she screwed up his training session here. But he's actually like, no, that's a perfectly valid way of dealing with situations. And the fact that you use the Force to do it is like just as good as if you had, anticipated where it was going to be or whatever.
Yeah, like he's kind of trying to wait to see how she handles a frustrating task rather than just giving up and being like, it's impossible. Yeah. And it's funny because Mara herself, she refers to her training with Palpatine as her, quote, Jedi training. And again, this book was written before the concept of the Jedi and Sith really existed. But one thing I did appreciate is that the conversation kind of touches on this idea that it was entirely physical training and that she never got any of the sort of spiritual or intellectual training that a real Jedi would go through. And I think that lines up pretty well with the modern interpretation of dark side Force users in sort of modern canon, where the Sith just kind of use the Force as a way to increase power and not as a way to sort of enlighten themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that those ideas kind of get shaped by the expanded universe stuff that sort of happened between Return of the Jedi and Phantom Menace, and even like through the Clone Wars, that this sort of consensus of what the distinctions between Jedi and Sith were kind of comes about through all of this extended material, that by the time we get to the 2010s, things are pretty well established, but it's because of all these books and other content. So to destroy the pod, Mara stabs it, and Luke views this as unorthodox and says that Obi-Wan never taught him how to use the tip of the saber. First of all, Obi-Wan never taught him anything. He knew Obi-Wan in terms of being a Force teacher for like a day, maybe. So yeah, Obi-Wan didn't teach him a lot of stuff. But I seem to remember a pretty big scene in Return of the Jedi where Vader's talking about his secret twin sister and saying, if you will not turn to the dark side, maybe she will. And the next thing that happens is Luke stabbing towards Vader with his lightsaber. Like, it's one of the biggest scenes in Return of the Jedi. And I don't know, it's just strange to me that, a stab with a sword is somehow unorthodox, especially considering it weighs nothing and poking him with the tip is still like a viable, it's not like a broadsword that the stabbing motion maybe isn't as effective as like with a saber.
Yeah, well, so a lot of, YouTubers or whatever that kind of re-choreograph their own lightsaber fights will take advantage of stabbing because of that exact thing you just mentioned, where it's like, hey, if this were a real thing, by far the most efficient way to use it would just be to do a precision poke rather than doing these big wind-ups that your opponent can very easily predict the arc of. I will say over time, I think the explanation for the lightsaber weightlessness is kind of changed, where it actually, I don't know if it's like gyroscopic force or something is applied. It's harder to stab and you need the force to guide it or whatever. But yeah, the idea that stabbing with a sword is some crazy idea is really ridiculous. Like, what do you think a sword is for? Like, in contrast to some of these previous scenes where we get a little more philosophical about the nature of the Force, we finally start talking about Luke's history with Vader. The whole exchange where he's recapping the plot of Return of the Jedi feels so clumsy and awkward, because he's like, well, yeah, and then Vader picked up the Emperor and chucked him down a hole. And it's like, you've taken all of the kind of fantastical fantasy elements of it and really boiled it down to just a very literal explanation. Like, I was picturing a Jedi to explain it in a much more eloquent, like, Palpatine finally got what he deserved or something, or Vader put a stop to him or something, some way to word it that isn't just, oh yeah, he picked him up and threw him into an open hole.
I will say one thing I do like about this explanation scene, though, is that Luke makes some sort of comment like, I only took one swing at Palpatine, and then he hit me with lightning later, and I never really had an opportunity, even if I had wanted to kill him. Like, I wasn't even positioned to. And Mara asks, like, wait, I thought you went to the Death Star to kill Palpatine. And Luke says, no, I was there to try to turn Vader back to the light side. Like, that killing Palpatine wasn't the reason I was there. And technically, I wasn't the one who actually killed him. But, I mean, if I hadn't been there, that whole situation would have happened. Palpatine would have survived. I like that he's sort of taking responsibility for what happened there. Because, like, he easily could have told Mara, like, hey, I didn't kill Palpatine. That was all Vader. Like, I'm completely blameless here. And I feel like a lot of media tries to give their heroes, like, the Batman Begins clause, where it's like, I'm not going to kill you, but I don't have to save you. And that, sort of lets them get away with being killers or, being involved in stuff. But, technically they weren't the one to swing the final blow, so they can sort of come out unscathed. And he doesn't have any illusions of, what happened there and his role in it. So I thought that was interesting.
Moving on a bit, Luke is sensing the aliens out in the woods, and he's like, there's some emotion there, but I can't figure out what it is. And it immediately reminds me of the problem in Star Trek The Next Generation, where they have Counselor Troy, who can sense emotions, which is supposed to be this really important thing. But every episode, she's like, I'm sensing some distress, but I can't tell what it is, or they're hiding something. And it's like, so the thing we already knew based on their body language and dialogue. It again illustrates that problem where turning a force power into this thing that they can just use at will, like a video game power, kind of ruins the mysticism of the whole thing.
Yeah, it's like, why was Troy given these abilities if they'd have to handicap it every episode, because she could just solve everything if she could, actually read people's minds. And she also has like telepathic abilities early on that never get used again. The Nogri eventually approach them, and we find out that they followed in secret because they sensed some hostility from Han back on Coruscant and didn't think that he would let them join if they offered to come along. And Han is like, look, I stopped turning down free help years ago. We're 5 people trying to assault an Imperial base. Yes, we'll take the super space ninjas to come with us, even if they annoy me a little bit. And he starts building some sort of rapport with them. He convinces them to stop calling him the consort of Lady Vader, and they settle on Han Clan Solo, because apparently that's how they like name people with the Nogri race or Nogri language. But it makes Han recall the initiation into the Ewok tribe, which he's like, well, it was helpful, but that is maybe the most ridiculous thing that's ever happened to me. And I think that's just Zahn's feelings coming through about, the Ewoks in general. And looking back, Return of the Jedi doesn't quite hold up quite as well as I thought it did as a kid, because the Ewok scenes do stand out quite a lot. especially compared to like the Vader Luke throne room confrontation scenes.
Yeah.
One quirk I did like here is that Mara's been traveling with them enough that when C-3PO starts giving his explanation of how many languages he can speak, she cuts him off immediately. Like it happens enough that even Mara's been with them for like a week and she knows that he's just going to ramble on anyways. C-3PO is talking about this because they're meeting the other primitive races on Wayland that, once again, even though they've been around Imperials and they've been around C'baoth before, they call the blasters lightning bows and the fighters are metal birds. And, we're getting back into that sort of Nogri, vibe with them.
Yeah, you'd think that a translation robot would be able to just translate and be like, oh, what their word for blaster is lightning bow. Okay, I'm just going to translate it as blaster.
Yeah, but we still got to point out how primitive they are,
Yep. So the native species here, or the native races here, confirm that there was a guardian on the planet before C'baoth showed up and killed him and then kind of became the guardian. When this was originally discussed in Heir to the Empire, I assumed, and I think we talked about this, that it was that was like a fake backstory that C'baoth had either been implanted with or concocted. But then now I'm wondering, where did he come from and how did this all happen? Because I don't think we ever really get the true explanation for how it all unfolded.
The only thing that even sort of makes sense to me is that the Guardian was just like the previous iteration that was guarding Mount Tantus, and then this clone C'baoth was kind of like the new one that they put in place, and maybe Palpatine just like assumed that he would kill the previous Guardian or something. Like, I think we still have to believe that C'baoth was created by Palpatine in order to guard Mount Tantus, because where else could he have come from?
Yeah.
So Mara talks with the Nogri now a little bit and kind of mentions that it was a running joke amongst the Imperials in the know of like how gullible the Nogri were, which, I don't know. You don't need to bring that up when you're like about to go into battle with them, just like making fun of how dumb they are.
Yeah.
But one of the Nogri refers to Luke as the son of Vader, and that is when things finally sort of click for Mara that, Luke, for whatever reason, never told her that Vader was his father. Palpatine obviously didn't. And it sort of recontextualizes the entire Luke Vader Palpatine dynamic and her relation to it, because I think she previously viewed it as she's getting revenge for her master, and this is some sort of like honor bound thing that she needs to do as the Emperor's hand. But now hearing this part, it's more that, this entire thing was just sort of this running feud between Vader and Palpatine, and that the command to kill Luke was more about just like Palpatine trying to get one last one over Vader, and like, yeah, you may have just killed me, but, this whole thing was to save your son, and now I'm sending my assassin to go kill Luke to get one back on Vader. But it's not the same situation that she actually thought it was. So this General Koval, who flies C'baoth to Wayland, he's under control of C'baoth, and we finally get the downside to all this force control, that the second he steps into an Isalamiri field, so many brain functions that C'baoth had been taking over cease, and he just dies immediately. So there are some limitations here. When Pelion finds out, in his head, he keeps just saying, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so, because every single scene, Pelion keeps telling Thrawn, like, hey man, C'baoth is bad news. Like, I really don't think we should be working with him. And Thrawn keeps dismissing it. And now Pelion finally gets his sort of redemption here. And so Thrawn acts pretty quickly when he hears about what happened with Koval, and instructs anybody that even talked to C'baoth to sort of be isolated, and he could even tell his soldiers what happened. But he's not taking any risks now that C'baoth is sort of on his own, and he thinks that just keeping him confined to the throne room with all the Isalamiri should be enough to take him off the board for now.
Yeah, and then he kind of finally reveals, like, okay, yeah, we're gonna kill C'baoth. And I did really like the explanation that it's like, well, we could still clone him, which seems to be what he was planning all along, or at least a backup plan he had was, okay, if C'baoth goes off the rails, we can still keep his DNA and apparently infinitely clone the Jedi, but this time don't accelerate their growth as rapidly so that they can sort of develop normally and not have any clone insanity. And he mentions that he could hide the children somewhere remote, possibly in the unknown regions, which is where he was all this time in the original trilogy off screen. We still don't know why the Emperor sent him there, and I guess we don't find out in this book. But I did like this concept that it's like, oh yeah, I forgot that's a possibility of all these cloning cylinders. You could just infinitely clone Jedi if you wanted to. Maybe not the best idea, but...
Yeah, I think Pelion even says, like, oh man, like, we're having as much trouble as we're having with one C'baoth. You want to make 10 now? Like, that's going to be an absolute nightmare.
Wedge attends Akbar's officers' meeting to discuss plans to steal a CGT array from the Imperials to clear the asteroids. They opt to attack the Imperial shipyards on Bilbringi rather than the less defended Tangreen, believing it to be a trap. Akbar moves forces to give the appearance that their target is Tangreen. The military command on Coruscant analyzes footage of Ukio provided by Card and Gillespie and figures out the shield generator trick. Winter receives the location of Wayland from the Nogri, but the Council decides not to send backup and continue with the Tangreen feint. Card monitors the New Republic movements and predicts that Tangreen will be the target. He proposes to Mazik and the smugglers that they try to steal the Bilbringi array while the battle happens at Tangreen. Meanwhile, Thrawn analyzes Republic movement around Tangreen and deduces that the true target is Bilbringi and moves the fleet to the shipyards to prepare his trap. Wedge and Rogue Squadron members Hobby Clivian and Wes Jansen spend off-duty time in a seedy cantina to spread false info that the Republic is targeting Tangreen. Card's people, including Aves, happen to be there, and they catch an Imperial spy monitoring the rogues before making contact. As thanks, Wedge gives them the time of the supposed assault on Tangreen. As the mission time approaches, the New Republic, Empire, and smugglers all prepare for operations on Bilbringi.
So we get an appearance from Pash Kraken here, who was mentioned earlier as the creator of the Kraken twist, and he and Wedge just kind of talk to give us some exposition for how the battle's going. They bring up, I think, Wing Commander Varth is his name, as like another squad leader that they're hoping survived the attack. And this was just interesting for me because Varth gets mentioned a couple times in the Rogue Squadron books, and I had kind of always assumed that he must show up in like a bunch of places, and that was just an offhand mention there. Turns out Timothy Zahn invented Varth, and outside of that mention in Rogue Squadron books is never brought up again. So this is more just Zahn off the cuff creating new characters that may or may not ever be part of Star Wars again. I think that this meeting happens on Home One, and which is Akbar's flagship, and where they staged the Endor attack in Return of the Jedi. And we even get a scene where Akbar hands over the meeting to Crick's General Maydean, which happens in Return of the Jedi. And I feel like they're just getting too close to matching the final act here.
Yeah, I'll have a lot more to say about that at the end.
So on Coruscant, they have the footage of one of the attacks that bypassed the shield generator, and they're doing this, zoom and enhance on the footage to try to get a better picture of it. But I do like that they at least mention that the algorithm that cleans it up can only do so much, and that, they're not able to get a good picture, which for 1993 is actually like a pretty good understanding of digital compression and how an algorithm would work, given that, I don't know, were digital cameras even a thing in 93?
I mean, I'm sure they were, but yeah, like AI upscaling wasn't, Yeah, so then they're talking about how, like, okay, well, we have to clear out these asteroids. Like, that is our top priority. So even if there's some kind of shenanigans and it's a trap that Thrawn's pulling us into, like, we have no choice. We have to figure out how to do it. And of all people, Phalia is like, why? What if we just don't deal with it? And I actually really like this because there's so many times in these stories where it's like some big thing happens or a MacGuffin is presented. It's like, we have to go do this thing. And very rarely do characters just openly be like, do we? Or can we just ignore it? Because this is exactly what he wants. And he mentions, we have adequate supplies and communication. So yeah, it's annoying, but it doesn't actually hinder us as much as we kind of were assuming before. And I thought this was just a really good start to the Thalia redemption arc. Not that he gets a ton, but it did for me kind of solidify that, like, okay, maybe he did have some reason for being on the council that we just like didn't see before. Under all of the bluster and political maneuvering, he does perhaps have some tactical value that hadn't been explored before. So I liked it.
Yeah, I mean, he's been pretty much off the board in this book. He's had his self-induced exile or silence here. He does become a little... His tune does change a bit when Leia brings up Mount Tantus, and all of a sudden he's like, ooh, there's some stuff in there that we really don't want Thrawn finding, and he's vague about it, but he suddenly becomes sort of invested in, recapturing Mount Tantus. And so there's this debate among the military leaders, like how much they can trust Card, because he's the one that provided the footage. But Mon Mothma was pretty practical here about, enlisting smugglers. A little less practical when Leia and Winter won't tell her where they got this information for where Wayland is, because it was actually the Nogri that transmitted it, and they don't want to bring up the Nogri yet. And it's actually Bella Bliss that steps in and sort of says, like, look, we can trust Leia. We don't really need to interrogate this too much. And so we are finally seeing, somebody, Bella Bliss, sort of serving his function here and standing up to Mon Mothma in a way that, he wasn't able to before. We get an appearance from Rogue Squadron members Wes Jansen and Derek Hobby Clivian. I think that's his name. Yeah, Clivian, who I guess are like minor characters from Empire Strikes Back. And, this is just a little cameo for them. But because this is Star Wars, this would normally be an example of like, somebody that was just had a couple lines in the movie. Timothy Zahn is including here. But because of so many like Rogue Squadron video games and other content that's come out since then, for me, Jansen and Hobby are kind of ubiquitous to Star Wars in a way that probably is beyond their actual importance to the franchise.
Yeah, no bit role is too small to have its own spin-off series or cameo later. I did think it was funny, too, that because the only lines we get in the movies are Jansen and Hobby, it ignores the fact that Jansen is his last name and Hobby is his first name. But it's just like, we mix and match as needed.
Well,
unless Hobby's like a nickname.
His first name is Derek. He's Derek.
Oh, that's right.
Hobby Clivian.
Hobby Clivian. Okay, that's right.
Which is also just an insane thing, an insane detail to have for a character that is never actually shown on screen. Luke just like calls out for him. Like, oh wait, yeah, he is, right?
I think he is. I think he's the one, like, 2 X-Wings against a Star Destroyer. Maybe retroactively assign that. I don't know. Maybe it was in the script, maybe not.
Right, but because in the Rogue Squadron video game, his main personality trait is the like skeptic, because he had that one line about X-Wings going against the Star Destroyers.
They also mentioned that Rogue Squadron has their distinctive patches, and I vaguely recall from the X-Wing books they mentioned some of this stuff, and I think it's just now occurring to me that this is where a lot of these concepts originated. They took things from this book and then extended them into the later books. But, as far as I saw in the movies and everything, like, the pilots don't have any identifying traits for what squadron they belong to. And I think part of that also is in every movie, the squadrons change based on the battle. It's like Rogue Squadron and Red Squadron. These are not permanent fixtures of the Republic fleet. They are ad hoc assignments based on the mission. But
yeah, you actually get the scene in the first X-Wing book of them creating the patch. So that's kind of funny that it's here. So Thrawn is sort of making his final plans for the big battle at Bilbringi, and we find out that he somehow got his hands on the art in Bella Bliss's house on Corellia and his Senate office, and he also somehow procured some of Akbar's paintings, which may have been from his own person. Like, I don't know if Akbar was selling paintings, but this art thing is getting out of control.
I mean, George Bush does it. Like, yeah, you would think most of this would just immediately be incinerated by the Empire, right? Like, there's no reason why they would catalog Admiral Akbar's personal paintings.
Yeah, Bella Bliss was thought to have been dead for like 10 years, and somehow he still is able to find what he had hanging in his office on Coruscant. But yeah, art aside, I do think this is a pretty good setup for sort of the home stretch of this trilogy, where you have this big confrontation happening at Bilbringi, and you have the smugglers, you have the Empire, you have the Republic, and they're all sort of trying to deceive each other, and everything's sort of coming to a head here. And within these schemes, we also have the Nogri sort of lurking. They're waiting to bide their time, and the one piece that Thrawn has no knowledge of is that Luke and Mara actually left Coruscant and are on Wayland. So that's kind of the biggest piece of information he doesn't have here. Leia searches Imperial records for information on cloning techniques to explain the fast growth rate of Thrawn's clones. The wild Card arrives in orbit, and Card makes contact to discuss Mara's release. In exchange for being able to speak to Mara, Card reveals that the New Republic had already cleared the 22 asteroids, as he observed Thrawn loading them at Bilbringi. When Card mentions his imprisonment on the Chimera, Leia realizes that rapidly aged clones go crazy due to effects from the Force, and that Thrawn is raising them around Yasala Miri to prevent this from happening. While Leia tries to convince Card to bring her to Wayland to warn Luke and Mara that they could lose their connection to the Force, Leia's Nogri bodyguards catch Phalia eavesdropping. Phalia implores Card to go to Wayland because what Thrawn may find in Mount Tantus could be devastating for both Bothans and the rest of the galaxy. After Card extorts 70,000 credits from Phalia, he agrees to take Leia. On Wayland, Luke notices a dead zone in the Force inside Mount Tantus, but decides to go forward with the operation, and they are able to find an external air vent to sneak in. Force-controlled natives attack the front entrance, demanding C'baoth's release, giving Luke's group cover to enter the mountain. Leia and Card arrive and are able to contact the Nogri rearguard left by Luke and Han and find the same entrance. They follow through the air vent and are able to track Luke and Mara using Card's pet Vronskirs. Luke's group finds the cloning facility while the attack on the main entrance continues. He and Mara decide to search for the throne room in hopes that they can find a self-destruct mechanism while the others look for a way to sabotage the base. Shortly after they leave, R2 discovers that C'baoth is being held in the throne room, and Han follows them. Lando and Chewbacca defend their position in the facility while rigging the cloning cylinders to overload on command. Leia and Card find Han, and the three follow Luke to the throne room. So Leia's finally able to put together what's going on with the clones based off something Mara had mentioned about Thrawn harvesting thousands of Yasala Miri on Merkur. And so the explanation for this clone madness stuff is that exact duplicates in the Force creates a natural resonance between clones and the original. And that resonance, if you raise them too quickly and you develop their brains too quickly, causes them to go crazy. Apparently, it doesn't cause a problem after they age. It's only during the sort of aging process. And so by raising them in the force field of the Yasala Miri, this resonance doesn't happen, and they're able to achieve adulthood without these problems. And that's how he's able to grow them in like 10 days.
Sure. That feels awfully convenient for the plot of the book. Like, I don't know. I didn't totally jive with this. I was a little confused by the explanation.
Yeah, I mean, he's the one that introduced clone madness. So, he's like solving a problem that he created, I guess, just to, add more mystery to the book. So, I've read this book a lot of times. Going into it, my recollection for how this worked was not force resonance between clones in the original or anything to do with like exact duplicates, because like identical twins exist.
Right.
That would be the same thing. The way I had it in my head was just like the natural presence or pressure from the force was like too much for a brain to like be able to handle if you developed it too quickly, was how I remembered it happening. But apparently that's not it. But I mean, that I think was just like the simpler explanation for me, because the force resonance raises all types of questions and doesn't make sense given what we see here, and then especially later in this book.
I think what would have worked a lot better is if they had, as they have in several other parts of this book or the rest of the trilogy, is thrown out a couple of possible explanations but left it open-ended and say, okay, something about the aging acceleration process messes it, whether it's A, B, or C, but clearly applying Yasala Miri to the equation helps solve this problem. Because I think, committing to this idea of clone brain resonance really hamstrings you going forward for how the Force works. And
so Leia goes to Card and is trying to get him to bring her to Wayland so they can warn Luke and Mara. And Card tries to play the tough guy and says, Mara's just a member of my organization. I can't be going this far to rescue her. Leia says, that's not true, like calls him out on it immediately. And he's able to save Faith by extorting Phalia so that he's not going to the rescue. He's not being a hero. He's doing this for the cash. Sounding a lot like Han, initially in A New Hope. But the total is 70,000 credits. So for reference, Han wanted 10 to go to Alderaan. Obi-Wan offered 2 now and 15 later. So I guess just 70,000 credits is probably a lot more than $70,000 if we're thinking about like Han was in debt to Jabba for, some huge amount of money.
Yeah, because I think on one hand it's like, well, how much would a car have cost in 1979? Like, if that's the price of Luke's speeder. I always kind of imagined they were roughly 1-to-1 with the U.S. dollar, but yeah, you're right. 10,000 doesn't seem like a lot if you're in debt to the gangsters. But
like, how big was Han's bounty? If like the whole galaxy was chasing after him at some point because of this Jabba bounty. But yeah, so while Leia and Card are en route to warn them about the Ysalamiri, Luke, of course, just senses the Ysalamiri because it's pretty obvious. Han wants to turn around immediately. Luke just thinks they should continue, even though he won't be able to use the Force. But even without a Jedi, I do have to wonder, like, what was their plan here to begin with? They have 5 people. Like, how are they planning on taking down all of Mount Tantus by themselves?
Yeah, it seems pretty dumb.
So Mara and Luke talk a bit more about C'baoth. She's worried about C'baoth taking control of her and this prophecy about her kneeling in front of him. And Luke says, that could have been a lie. It could be wrong. And you can't be forced into this. It's going to be your choice. C'baoth doesn't have a say here. And then Mara's like, are you sure the Force doesn't work that way? And he's like, I don't know, maybe. So not exactly the most reassuring response there. But I think the more interesting thing with this conversation is they bring up the whole last command from Palpatine that keeps ringing out in her brain, telling her to kill him. And he says to her, like, you can't use that as an excuse for what happens going forward. If you kill me, you can't be blaming it on the fact that Palpatine's dead orders are causing you to. You have to make a decision, and that's, I think, kind of going along with the sort of destiny that she has to confront here. I like that he did sort of, directly confront her using that command as, an excuse for her behavior.
Something that kind of bugged me here was that Card and Leia are like, oh, we got to go to Wayland and warn them what's going on. There's really no reason for them to do that. Like, if you remember earlier in the book, Luke specifically didn't race back to Coruscant after his vision of the Imperial attack, specifically because for the exact fear that he would make things worse by going. Not that that's what ultimately happens with Leia, but like just taking off and trying to show up. It's like they just spent, I don't know how many days traipsing through the jungle to avoid using repulsor lifts. And then they're like, there they are, land near them. It's like, why did you need to come here to tell them like, hey, it's going to be dangerous? It's like, yeah, if we're going to do it at all, we know that it's going to be kind of a nightmare. It's sort of silly, but it seemed like just a way to get Leia onto the planet so she could be in the final battle.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird order of operations thing because it's, getting Card and Leia there, but they had other things to do before this. But you also probably could have just reworked the order that things happened in the plot so that, they had already left before everybody was stuck on Coruscant or something.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of odd scene with Han here where he sees that Mara is kind of going through it and internally just says something like, hold it together, kid. He calls Luke kid and now is also calling Mara kid, even because I guess she's like the same age as Luke. But I mean, they're both in their like mid to late 20s now. Like he called Luke kid when he met him because he was like a teenager.
Yeah.
But, it's weird that he's applying it to Mara now, even if she is the same age as Luke.
Yeah, and Leia is literally the same age as Luke, so it's kind of bizarre.
It was the 70s. Things were a little different back then.
That's true. God, I'm just remembering what they did in Indiana Jones with the professor.
Yeah, so as Han, Leia, and Card are chasing after Luke and Mara, Han just has this thought to himself, like, Oh man, this is gonna suck. Like the last time I met a Dark Jedi, I was on Cloud City, and that ended up with me being tortured for a week and then frozen in carbonite. Like this is gonna be terrible.
Luke and Mara enter the throne room and find C'baoth waiting for them. C'baoth activates a detonator that kills the Ysalamiri and returns the Force. He immediately strikes Luke and Mara with Force lightning, though Luke is able to block most of it. C'baoth summons his new servant, a clone of Luke created from his severed hand from Cloud City. The clone attacks Luke, who is at a disadvantage due to Force resonance with the clone. Mara recovers from the Force lightning and tries to keep C'baoth out of her head as they watch the duel. Leia, Han, and Karrde arrive, and Han tries to shoot C'baoth but is stopped by the Force. Luke offers to stay with C'baoth if he allows the others to leave, but C'baoth insists that Mara also stay, and the clone attacks again. Seeing an opening, Mara grabs Leia's lightsaber and charges the clone. The clone takes a swipe at Luke, but hits a viewing screen that Luke had been intentionally backing into, causing it to explode in his face. While the clone is stunned, Mara closes in and cuts him down. C'baoth tries to bring the ceiling down to bury everyone in the throne room. Stormtroopers breach the cloning facility, and Lando and Chewbacca blow the charges. Lando warns Han over comlink that the facility's reactor will likely explode, and Han tells them to escape as they've been trapped by C'baoth. Before she's buried in rubble, Mara cuts through the floor, giving her room to escape. While everyone else divides C'baoth's attention, Mara's able to reach and kill him. The resulting force shockwave from C'baoth's death damages the throne room walls, and Luke and Leia are able to cut their way out with lightsabers.
I really enjoy that the scene starts with them walking into the throne room, and C'baoth has intentionally turned his chair around facing away from the door just so he can do like a dramatic chair turn reveal and be like, "Welcome to my dungeon," or whatever. So he has that big introduction, and then he goes into this long-winded speech about how everything that's happened he's put in motion to get Luke and Mara there, and together they will usher in a new Jedi rule of the galaxy. And it's this big, dramatic speech here.
Yeah, I mean, they use it as a plot point to say, I don't know why the Emperor would have left the chair facing the wrong way. It's like, that's supposed to hint to you that, oh, there's somebody sitting in it. But like, I also don't know why there would be somebody sitting in it. Like, why wouldn't it just be facing the normal way? Like,
so like in Return of the Jedi, it faces out, but I'm pretty sure there's like a window there.
Yeah, he's watching
like
the
looking
battle.
out the window. They're inside a mountain. There's nothing there. It's just pointing to like a wall.
They have their view screens or whatever, but like they're not turned on. Yeah, it's a funny moment. I did like his little speech. He kind of talks about the true nature of the Jedi and the power. And he says something, it harkens back to what you said in the first episode about how a lot of the encounter that Luke had with him is sort of, he's like this anti-Yoda, right? Like he has a similar introduction, but it's all kind of corrupted and twisted. And in the same way, it's like he still views the Force. It's like, oh, it's not just simple tricks of matter and energy. It's the ability to reshape the galaxy in your own vision and extend yourself. And so, I don't know. I'm glad that it wasn't him just being like, and so it makes your muscles really big. It's like, no, he also has this view of the Force that's a little beyond what Yoda calls this crude matter.
Yeah, and I think it just sort of speaks to how Zahn views it as well. Whether this is because it's one of the earlier stories or just how he personally feels, we don't have the Force be as much just like a list of video game skills that can be turned on and off here and there. And it is this more like philosophical thing, even coming from Dark Jedi.
Well, and I think it's both, right? Like, I think one of my bigger complaints of this series is that there are a lot of moments where it's treated as this video gaming thing. So I think it's a delicate balance because the movies also had some of that. But at the very least, yeah, the main important pieces of the story hinge on the Force being this thing that's greater than just the power of it.
He also drops a little nugget here saying that even Palpatine didn't truly control Vader. I mean, how he found out about it when he was stranded on Wayland is one question, but like, do you think Luke publicized that Vader turned on the Emperor in the end as like trying to redeem him, or did he just sort of, pop out of the Death Star hauling Vader's corpse and just be like, okay, it's over?
Yeah, I would think not. I would think he's not going around advertising this. I would imagine some of the Imperials that saw it happening as they're getting in the escape pods or whatever were like, what's up with that? Why is someone dragging my old boss's corpse across the floor? So I'm sure word spreads in some fashion, but yeah, I don't know.
Another thing that just thought was an interesting point here is Mara talks about how the Old Republic and the Jedi lasted 1,000 generations, and really Palpatine was what, 20 years maybe.
Right.
All this Sith machinations and planning, and he finally defeats the Jedi, and he's just killed 20 years after. It's almost nothing compared to, supposedly this was all to bring balance to the Force, but it was barely a second in the long term.
And again, the movies and these books were written before like most of the Sith lore was fleshed out. So it's unusual that he wants like a Sith empire when the rule of two exists and you can only have two Sith, right? Like the reason the Jedi were able to stay in power for 1,000 generations is because there was more than two of them. They're kind of baked into the system.
So that brings us to something I've sort of been dreading talking about, which is the clone of Luke Skywalker named Luke Skywalker, which, is really, the naming convention was already silly, but to have it be applied to a character we already know kind of just kicks it up another notch. And, if you wanted to say that Legends canon was completely worthless and, Disney was 100% justified in just jettisoning all of it, your argument can kind of start and end just by mentioning Luke Skywalker and how ridiculous it is.
Yeah. Do they ever refer to him by name in conversation, or is it just what the book, like the narrator, tells you?
I think C'baoth might say his name once. I'll be honest, like, before rereading it again, I had it in my head that they never actually called him that, and it was just like the quote unquote official name because that's how the naming works. But it is explicitly written once or twice, and I'm pretty sure C'baoth says it too.
Yeah, and so the clone Luke is carrying Luke's original blue lightsaber, which was Anakin's lightsaber, and was cloned from the DNA of his severed hand from that time it got cut off in Cloud City, and then they just put it in a bag of ice and brought it to Mount Tantus. I don't know. It was stupid in The Force Awakens, and it's stupid here. Like, didn't it just fall out and get shot into the sky? Like,
yeah, I mean, this really wasn't something that had to be brought back, and I guess it's because that he wanted to have this clone Luke, but like you could have found some other way to get his DNA, right?
Yeah.
Although, because later C'baoth mentions that he wants to keep Mara alive long enough to clone her, and I think Thrawn says something similar about C'baoth. So I do wonder, the cloning process, how much do you need of the person, like the original, and it's just kind of weird that, you could just kill Mara and take a blood sample or a skin sample or whatever you need, presumably, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it makes sense narratively that you want some constraints on how the DNA can be acquired. Otherwise, anyone could just clone anyone else at any time. And so if there's some requirement that it's like you need a live donor and tissue that, you need live tissue, basically, that does make it a little more challenging for the enemies. But then it's like, okay, well, what did they do with his infected hand that fell 8,000 feet into like a pile of garbage? Like, did they really get it into containment fast enough and then shipped in a refrigerator or something,
But all this is just so we can have the Luke on Luke sword fight, right?
Yeah, and I guess I'm just saying they could have done it with just the lightsaber and it would be enough. Yeah, and then I don't know how you feel about this. So this comes up throughout the book that when Luke is sensing the clone, something about the wavelengths that the other brain is emitting make it hard to focus, and he has this buzzing sound in his head. And that same principle applies to how they created the clone army and how C'baoth controls the clone army and everything. Why? I don't know. It just doesn't. Why would that be the assumption that that's how it works?
Yeah, like why does the Force care if somebody's brain pattern is the same? Like it's that simple.
Right. And in the Clone Wars TV show, for all of the potential faults that had, like, they make it very clear. I think even in the first episode, they talk about how you're all clones, but like the Force flows through you all differently. Like you are separate beings who just look the same. And as far as the Force is concerned, you're not. Like, it doesn't matter that you're cloned from each other's DNA. I kind of prefer that because, well, this is just bizarre. I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and it's also so this whole resonance thing is kind of slowing Luke down through this entire fight, but the clone of Luke isn't affected for some reason, or like the clone of Luke doesn't seem to be having any problems, and maybe you can explain it by it's actually just C'baoth like fully puppeting him, and it's not he's not making any decisions, but it's just weird that you introduce this concept of like, oh yeah, their force powers are clashing with each other because of this resonance, but it's only affecting one of them.
Yeah, I just think there were better ways to handle this that maybe would only be specific to two force wielding clones that have the same, they're like kind of mind tricking each other or something. But if it were like a little more intentional or something less vague than just, oh, we're in the same room and we're tuned to the same frequency, just
I also think that if you're going to make an evil Luke clone, he should actually be an evil Luke clone. But this clone doesn't speak. He doesn't have like emotions or personalities. He's just basically a robot that they fight. I was looking up for more information about the character, and the Wikipedia or the Star Wars wiki discussion said that, this is an experience that would haunt Luke going forward. And to be honest, like I can remember maybe one or two offhand mentions of this in everything that comes after. Like, I don't think this, if it was supposed to be this like major impact on him, it wasn't that big a deal. He does like briefly contemplate the moral implications of killing his own clone. And he's like, I wonder if that's a dark side action, and like, I wonder if I'll go crazy if I kill him. And I guess not. Like it's not,
yeah.
not really a big impact.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the more you learn about clone C'baoth, the more it's like, oh, okay, he, again, is this sort of like bizarre version of the original. He has some of the personality traits. Luke digs through the library archives to learn about C'baoth's history, and it seems like there's some things that line up a little bit. And then obviously he's got clone madness and he turns evil and like he differs in those ways. But yeah, you would expect this Luke to have some I don't know. Yeah, I don't know why he wouldn't be similar in that way. I guess he didn't have any memories implanted, which is something that's harder to do, but like they never really explain exactly how the original C'baoth had like what his memory makeup is or why he behaves similar to the original. Yeah, so in keeping with the trend of kind of imitating things that were in Return of the Jedi, that fight had Luke doing backflips, Vader throwing lightsabers, etc. This one has lots of occasions where they specifically say Luke does a backflip to jump up onto a higher platform or whatever. I don't know how necessary it is for him to do a backflip every single time. It works on a screen because it's kind of cool, but seeing it written down really draws attention to how impractical that would actually be. Like there's no reason to do that.
Yeah, and it's not just one backflip and one saber throw. It's like 4 or 5 of each, right?
He backflipped again. Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of keeping with the theme of like the Jedi trials and Jedi facing their destiny, C'baoth views this as a trial for Luke, for him to pass to become his apprentice. Like this is Luke's final exam to be admitted into the C'baoth, school of the Force. And I think it just sort of reinforces that Yoda's final condition for Luke becoming a Jedi was that he had to go confront Vader. And I like the idea that graduating to a full-blown Jedi isn't just like taking a test or something, or there's some sort of major personal ordeal that you have to overcome, and once you complete that successfully, that's what makes you a Jedi, not just like, well, I completed the 10-step course and now I passed, so I'm the Jedi.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what they did in Phantom Menace with Obi-Wan, is like you're supposed to take the trials to become a Jedi Knight, and it's like, okay, well, you cut Darth Maul in half, so that's good enough. Like the trials are just a facsimile of the kinds of things we want you to figure out. So yeah, I agree. I like this as kind of a through line.
So at this point, Leia, Han, and Card show up. Han immediately tries to shoot C'baoth, just like he immediately tried to shoot Vader, to basically the same results. When C'baoth sees Leia, he makes this like bombastic proclamation: "Welcome, my new apprentice. I will teach you the true ways of the Force." Like, I don't know. I really like his just over-the-top craziness here. There's just more flips and more saber throws, but eventually Luke uses the view screen to blind the clone, and Mara kills him. And I do like, again, that it's not Luke just being like, my force power level is greater than your force power. And he's, he was sort of feigning being at a disadvantage the whole time so he could back up towards the view screens to sort of create this moment. And yeah, so because Mara's the one that kills clone Luke, that technicality satisfies the Emperor's last command, so that silences his "you must kill Luke Skywalker" voice happening over again, which I think is a clever way to, I mean, Zahn's the one that introduced it, so it had to be resolved some way, but this is sort of an interesting way to do it.
I don't know how I feel about it, because I agree, it is. I was kind of trying to remember if that was what was going to happen, but it does feel a little contrived, because it's like, yeah, like you said, Zahn is the one who wrote that into existence 2 books ago.
Overall, this was a pretty good fight scene. There's definitely sort of an escalation of tension and kind of helplessness on the heroes' parts that, C'baoth just keeps kind of countering everything that they're doing while Luke is on the defensive. Once again, just like on Mercure, they give an excuse for why Luke isn't at full power. I'm not sure if that's sort of a conscious decision because Zahn didn't want to commit fully to exactly what Luke can do in these big fight situations, or if he just thought it would be more interesting this way. But yeah, I think there was a general sense of excitement when Mara finally gets her hand on a lightsaber and joins the fight. So overall, I thought it was a pretty good scene. It felt a little like a low budget 90s or 80s action film with the final scene where somebody gets kicked into a jet engine or something to finish them off. The thing is, though, it's not the end. It's not the actual end of the scene because now they have to deal with C'baoth. So it's it's not the final boss. Now we got the secret final boss, and so we're put in a Cell versus Gohan kind of stalemate between Mara and C'baoth, where she's getting rocks flung in her face and slowly trying to advance. But not big rocks, I guess, just enough to kind of annoy her, because if she closes her eyes and blocks her face, that's enough to kind of keep her safe from him. So is he just shooting sand at her?
Yeah, I think they describe them as pebble sized or something, but
yeah, I guess there were no more rocks from the ceiling that he tore down. And so, yeah, everybody's making sort of their attempt to distract him or attack him, and he keeps countering until, Luke finally cuts the leash on the Vronskers, and that distracts him enough that Mara is able to get up close, and then she drops to her knees to avoid one last force lightning and stabs him through the chest. Second time doing the stabbing move, so that's why we foreshadowed it before with her stabbing technique, her secret stabbing technique. But so this also satisfies the C'baoth prophecy that she'd kneel before him, which I feel like right after doing that with the last command from Palpatine sort of seems like you're double dipping on this prophecy resolution. I know it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of the same concept.
No, I felt the same way, where it's oh, that thing they've been alluding to is resolved, and then they do it immediately after, and it's oh, okay. And yeah, again, we don't get too many examples of what a Force vision looks like, but I'm pretty sure if his vision of her kneeling was him throwing a wave of rocks at her and her clutching a lightsaber trying to stab him, that she was not going to be a faithful servant.
Just choose one or the other. We didn't need the clone command and this.
Yeah. Yeah, and then when they finally do kill him, he explodes in this force fire, this blue explosion, similar to how Palpatine exploded when he got thrown down the shaft. So I guess that's what we're going with, is when a dark Jedi dies, they explode, and it has splash damage. I don't know. I don't know that we know why Palpatine exploded, but I guess here they're just saying that's what it is.
It definitely does happen more after this, but it's not every time a vaguely dark Jedi dies, they explode in a fiery shockwave.
Yeah, I'm curious to see going forward, as the number of Force users increases in these books, how many of them disappear versus explode versus just don't disappear at all. Because that was, people didn't know until Phantom Menace came out and Qui-Gon didn't disappear, that was not normal. So I don't know what people assumed in the 90s.
There's a lot more I could say about this, but we probably don't have time to get into the...
Yeah. All right. We'll get to it when we get to it.
Yeah, in 6 years from now. One thing I found kind of interesting, just sort of having read a bunch of the other books, is that Leia actually displays a pretty good amount of force ability here. Like, she's the one feeding Mara instructions while she's covering her eyes and, you know, is trying to get her, like, using the force to try to get her hand on a gun and blocking, like, C'baoth's lightning. And honestly, compared to some of the books that even come after this, she actually gets to use the force in this one. And going forward, a lot of people just kind of ignore the fact that she has Jedi abilities until, like, very, very late, like way past the point where she should have had Jedi powers. And I know they didn't do it in the sequel trilogy, and then they had that, like, weird
Space Mary Poppins
Rise of Skywalker thing where it's like, oh, if I train in the Force, I'd kill my son, or something, was like the reason she didn't become a Jedi.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, there's never really like a great, the only explanation here is like she's too busy doing politics. But I don't know, I like that she actually got to use the Force here, because a lot of authors seem to forget it.
Yeah, that's disappointing to hear, because, like, in theory, she has just as much potential as Luke. Like, I would like to see that.
I do have to wonder if, you know, that certain segment of the fan base, if this had been made into a TV show or a movie and Mara gets to kill both the bad guys and Luke doesn't, what sort of 7-hour long Kathleen Kennedy ruined Star Wars videos would be made about this, and how, like, Mara's such a Mary Sue.
Yeah, and here's the thing. All of Zahn's original characters feel like Mary Sue's in a way, right? It's like, Garm Bella Bliss, he's the most brilliant tactician ever, but he wasn't around because he was mad at Mon Mothma. And Mara Jade was secretly in the shadows, controlling global politics. And he does have a penchant for making his characters a little too cool in universe.
Yeah, I mean, Thrawn and Card are both, like, the best of at what they do too, right?
Right. But that's why I'm reading a book. I want to see new stories and characters. And if the entire book was just Han, Leia, Luke running around hallways like they were in A New Hope, I'd probably be pretty bored of it. So as contrived as a lot of it is, I do enjoy the fact that you can go new places with these other characters, because the main cast has already kind of had their most substantive character arcs. And that's not to say there isn't room to grow and that they haven't had some interesting development, but, like, yes, I want new characters being important and doing things. And it makes sense character-wise, like, she's still in her murder stab phase, whereas Luke is at least starting to pump the brakes and be like, how much murder is okay for light side Jedi? He still does it, but, like, it makes sense that she's the one doing the killing at the end.
Yeah, and I think Luke even, you know, he still tries to maybe not redeem C'baoth, but, like, offer him a way out, and, you know, still kind of trying to help him even at the end like this.
Right.
Aves and the smugglers reach Bilbringi without Card in disguised ships 3 hours before the supposed Tangreen operation. When the Imperial fleet arrives, they prepare to fight before they notice interdictors and Star Destroyers setting a trap and realize that Thrawn expects the New Republic. They decide to wait for the battle for a chance to steal the array during the chaos. When Akbar's fleet arrives, they are pulled out of hyperspace and encircled by Thrawn's forces. As Wedge and Rogue Squadron desperately fight off the ambush, he is contacted by Aves, who offers to coordinate the smugglers' escape vector with Rogue Squadron to help break through the Imperial line and draw forces back to the shipyard. As the rogues and smugglers break the line, Pellaeon receives an alert about the attack on Mount Tantus. As he is reading the details, including the Nogri's betrayal, Thrawn's Nogri bodyguard Rook slashes him in the throat and stabs Thrawn in the chest with his knife before fleeing. Pellaeon has enough strength to summon medics, who are able to stabilize him, but it is too late for Thrawn. With the Grand Admiral dead, he gives the order to retreat. After everyone returns to Coruscant, Mara considers her new lease on life without the Emperor's last command. She and Luke discuss Card's proposal to have Mara serve as a liaison between the New Republic and the smuggler coalition Card has assembled. Mara is hesitant, but Luke believes she is up to the task. As a parting gift, Luke gives her his old lightsaber as she begins her journey to become a full-fledged Jedi.
Okay, so in this final section, we finally see Grand Admiral Thrawn die. And, well, I'll just say it. His final line is, "But it was so artistically done." And then he smiles and dies. And Pellaeon's just like, what? What a line to end on. I mean, out of all of the like famous quotes that he's had, the important, impactful, like thoughtful things he says, it was so artistically like it's like a joke. It's like, what do we know about Thrawn? Well, he likes art. Well, okay, he should say that something was arty when he died. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and honestly, I still don't know what he's talking about here. Is he talking about him getting stabbed in the chest? Like that was artistically done as he's like bleeding out on the center console? Was he talking about his whole like plan and how well planned out it was, and this whole ambush, and he, everything was about to succeed for him, and then all of a sudden he loses? Like, is he lamenting that his artistic grand plan failed? I've read this book a bunch of times, and I never really figured out what he's even referring to here.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those options, but I could not figure out which.
Neither really makes a ton of sense, especially with the smile.
Right. That's the thing is, yeah.
So Rook is the one that kills Thrawn because the other Nogri were somehow able to communicate the whole Imperial betrayal to him. And I really like how Thrawn's death is handled here, where he loses specifically because of he doesn't have many character flaws, but sort of his arrogance and his blind spots specifically to, other alien species that he thinks he has a complete understanding of. All of that finally catches up with him.
Yeah, I mean, I think this really drives home the themes of the entire book, which is he's always judging other people and species based on, like, he thinks he can understand someone just by looking at their art and reducing them to that. And it's just really great poetic justice that this people that he's subjugated are the reason that he dies. Like, that's good writing. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that, the other piece of this is that he doesn't lose because his strategy is bad. He loses because Leia had compassion for the Nogri and reached out to them rather than just trying to kill all of them. And it does kind of follow everybody's favorite line from The Last Jedi, that you win by saving what you love, not destroying what you hate. It also made me think of another Rian Johnson property with Knives Out, where at the end of the first one, Daniel Craig says, "I want you to know you didn't win the game by playing it his way. You won it by playing your way because you had a good heart." And that's sort of this, a similar sort of situation that happens here with how Leia and the Nogri defeat Thrawn.
Yeah, and like the whole trilogy is about them building bridges between, trying to get the smugglers onto their side, and instead of like trying to suppress or threaten other factions or other people, they're trying to bring them over to their side. And that happens at the macro level, but it also happens at the individual level, where both Luke and Leia are faced several times with the opportunity to just like violently kill the people that are in their way, and they're like, maybe I can approach this from a different way, right? And so the entire plot section of Leia recruiting the Nogri and like helping them, and Luke talking about how he can't lose sight of the small picture, right? He has to be able to help people on an individual basis instead of just hand waving and saying, well, I have to do what's best for everybody and go off and do all this politics stuff. He wants to be on the ground, understanding the common man, and he keeps trying to save Thrawn, right? He keeps trying to save C'baoth, and Thrawn doesn't have any of that. Thrawn is pretty sociopathic, where it's like he will respect and treat people nicely if he thinks it's in his benefit, but he'll never do it just because it's the right thing. And yeah, in the long term, that finally catches up, where it's like you've hurt too many people for it to not.
Yeah, he turns the whole galaxy against him when he didn't necessarily have to.
Right.
The way he dies here really just emphasizes, I guess he doesn't technically die in Rebels, but the way that he's defeated in Rebels, where Ezra summons a fleet of space whales that just come and kidnap his Star Destroyer, and then they all just leave. Like,
yeah, completely misses the point of these books. Like, Thrawn is not just some cool character. Like, he's a guy that serves a bigger purpose in the narrative.
Yeah, there's nothing about space whales that, gets at his fundamental flaws or issues or arrogance or anything like that. Unless you just say he was like dismissive of the Force, I guess. But even if
even if he took the Force seriously, he still couldn't have predicted space whales.
Yeah, like I think it would have worked if he was hunting them for space blubber or something, right? It's like, oh, okay, the hunter becomes the hunted.
There's your space Moby Dick that you wanted for the original, for the new trilogy.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and so there's that piece of it, and then there's the Rook piece of it, who is also a character on Rebels, but while here you have him as Thrawn's bodyguard, and he's just, throughout all 3 books, is just constantly like belittled and insulted, and him and the Nogri from Thrawn. But he's always sort of lurking in the background, practicing his silent assassination techniques before it all comes to a head. You contrast with Rook on Rebels, who's just like a guy that's good at space kung fu and like fights the main characters a couple times, and then has like a Wile E. Coyote style death where he gets like kicked into a train or something. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, there's literally no reason to have Rook in the story if it's not part of the larger Nogri narrative, right? Like that's the whole point of the entire thing.
I mean, it's emblematic of Thrawn sort of showing up there anyways, but to mess up specifically the Nogri is pretty egregious. So we have a final conclusion back on Coruscant and the victory party or whatever's happening in this final conversation between Luke and Mara. And, you know, at the end of the day, the Skywalker family basically solved all of this on their own. They found Wayland. They killed C'baoth. They got rid of the cloning center. Leia's the one that turned the Nogri. Han's the one that recruited Bella Bliss. Their relationship with Card solved the asteroid issue and cleared Akbar. Han and Luke are the ones that, and Card are the ones that found the Katana fleet in the first place. Leia found Delta Source. The rest of the galaxy was basically either useless or an active impediment to them solving these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think the smugglers turned the tide of the space battle, and then the Nogri turned the tide on Wayland and then killed Thrawn. So I think but those are all because of Luke and Leia.
I guess more specifically, the rest of the New Republic government was completely useless.
Yeah.
The only one worth a damn was Bella Bliss, who again was recruited by Han. So
yeah, and only actively participates in the very later stages of this, like is reluctant to be a participant until it's kind of a crisis.
So Luke and Mara are talking. We get some more Lois and Clark, Lois Lane, Superman dynamic here. She straight up calls him farm boy.
Yeah, and then Mara makes a comment that like, oh, okay, well, Thrawn's dead. That means the war's over. And Luke's like, we already said that when the Emperor died 5 years ago, and we're still just doing cleanup work, which keeps seeming to get bigger and bigger. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think this is maybe an out-of-universe issue that they have to solve, which is we already concluded that the war ended in Return of the Jedi. How do we make an infinite number of extended stories after this? And it's the problem that the sequel trilogy had of like, we already did this. Why do we need to do it again?
The resolution with the Empire is not going to happen for quite a while here. Other things do happen, but most of the books going forward, at least until a certain point, the remnant of the Empire is still sort of lurking in the shadows and driving at least some of the conflict. So Luke gives Mara Anakin's lightsaber as sort of this like final graduation present, I guess, for overcoming her issues. And Mara even thinks that, you know, it's a symbolic gesture on his part that he's giving up, you know, that final link back to the past, that, you know, the past is dead, bury it. But I think it's funny that The Force Awakens also brought back the lightsaber as like a major plot point, because, I mean, I read this book and I knew that this lightsaber was reintroduced here and then handed over to Mara, but I was still like pretty confused why it was such a big deal in Force Awakens when that came out. Like, why is this lightsaber so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think by that point, they've maybe established a little more about the relationship between the crystal and the Force. Like, there's something spiritual about the crystal that makes it important or draws Jedi to it, and it's not just like a mechanical object.
One final point for me and 6 other people that care. So going forward, Mara's usually portrayed using the blue lightsaber, but for whatever reason, she sometimes shows up with a separate purple lightsaber, which I guess starts because Zahn later wrote a comic series called By the Emperor's Hand, where Palpatine built her a purple lightsaber and gave it to her, but then she lost it after Endor, which, first of all, I don't feel like she should have had a lightsaber before this, because she wasn't actually a Jedi, and like I thought they'd made that sort of distinction there, but
Yeah, her skill set is very much, she uses blasters, she uses hand-to-hand combat. Like everything in this book implies that she was not trained to use a lightsaber professionally.
and that she wasn't Palpatine's apprentice, right? He didn't view her as a potential Jedi. She was just another sort of tool for him to use that happened to have some Force abilities.
Right.
Yeah, so there's that purple lightsaber, and then apparently she also builds a separate purple one that sometimes shows up, but only in the video games, which are, I mentioned before, Mysteries of the Sith, and then she's a secret unlockable character in Masters of the Terras Kasi, which I don't know if you remember Masters of the Terras Kasi for the PlayStation.
Yes, I do. Yeah, of all of the canon content, I think that kind of trumps the books. It's sort of the highest source that you can go back to for accuracy.
All right, so that wraps up The Last Command as well as the Thrawn trilogy. So what were your opinions of the third book in this series, Chris?
Yeah, so it's funny because I feel like this is the book I remembered the least of. Maybe I said that about the last one too, but I really didn't remember a lot of it. And it's strange because I think this is probably the best of the three. You know, there is a much bigger sense of scale compared to the previous two, where there was sort of these low stakes mini conflicts. This one is like almost all out war. And normally I don't like that because it cheapens it if you do it too often. But in this case, I felt like it was well earned. They laid a lot of that groundwork in the previous two books, and the writing was just a lot better. There were fewer sort of MacGuffin, got to get the thing to go to the place to get the thing to go to the place. You know, I genuinely found myself excited to find out what would happen in the next chapter, see how they'd resolve something. There were a lot of clever resolutions. Another thing that stood out, now obviously this book very closely mirrors Return of the Jedi. Admiral Akbar says it appears to be a trap, and it ends in another throne room, very like explicitly meant to evoke the imagery of Return of the Jedi. Han draws a comparison to the bunker they raided on Endor. Like the whole second half takes place on the jungle, in a jungle setting. They make reference to the camo jacket that Han is wearing, just like in Return of the Jedi. So I don't know how intentional this was, but it came across to me as a clone, you know, in keeping with the theme of cloning and like distortion of clone madness. Like this was kind of a weird clone of Return of the Jedi, where on a superficial level it's very similar, but thematically it's like totally different. And you know, to put a capstone on that, they end the book by blowing up the Emperor's big box of memories. And like you said, bury the past. Like they are making a point like, hey, we're moving on from the old trilogy stuff. Now we're starting new stories. Yeah, I don't know. Again, maybe it wasn't intentional at all, but I perceived it that way, and it definitely enhanced my enjoyment of it. In terms of negatives, I mean, I think almost everything I said in our discussions were nitpicks. Like, I think on the whole, it was very enjoyable, and I don't have that many major problems with it. The one thing that I did take a little bit of an issue with is that Leia basically stays at home until the very end. And I get that this is sort of a product of its time, but like it reinforces this idea that the only thing a woman can be is a caretaker. And that's not to say that she has to be written like a man and doing all the things that the men are doing. I do think it's probably a good thing to represent, you know, motherhood in a society at war. But like, this is the person who blew a hole in the chute, dove down into the garbage in episode 4, and to have her basically be like, well, I have to stay home and take care of the babies, really takes away a lot of her agency as a character. And meanwhile, Han is just like, well, I don't have to deal with any of this, and just goes off and does whatever. And then it just feels really forced at the end when she's like, I have to go help them, and like at the last second shows up for basically no reason, right?
I think this is something that a lot of the books really struggle with for her. a lot of it because she's given this like position in the government and supposed to be sort of running things on Coruscant, but that also means she isn't as involved in a lot of the major plots. And a lot of the time they just end up having to come up with like stuff for her to do while Han and Luke are out, doing whatever it is they're doing. So I do think she probably did actually a little bit more in this book than the last two, like at least because you remember last time, like Akbar gets arrested and she just kind of like isn't trying to clear his name or anything. Like Han comes in and does everything. And at least here, while she's on Coruscant, she's sort of like driving things forward, even if it's not, the big action scenes that Luke and Han get.
I don't know. I guess I think it's a little bit of a shame that in her like debut appearance in the books, it's like, remember Leia from the movies? Well, she's pregnant now, so she's not doing anything fun for a little bit. It's just disappointing. And then one final thing that I really liked was how gradual C'baoth's sort of revelation towards his final form was, because the whole time you're second guessing, like, how crazy is he? How powerful is he? And you see him start to get a little more and more powerful near the later end of the trilogy, until the very end scene when you realize he's kind of infiltrated every part of the Empire, and like even all of his crazy claims where he's like, oh no, Luke and Mara will be my servants, like I've foreseen it, it's definitely gonna happen. They're like, he's crazy, I'm not going with him. And it turns out part of what he means is like, okay, if you won't join me, I can just clone you and just keep cloning you until I have one that works for me and like is my loyal apprentice, and then I'll take the twins and make them and whatever. And so yeah, I liked being surprised at how not insane he actually was, and like that he sort of earned the role of being an antagonist or an adversary for Thrawn.
Yeah, so I'd agree that this is the best of the three. It definitely had the most interesting climax. It also had the least amount of sort of like silly stuff that happened in the other books. Like there was no hot chocolate in this one, and we didn't have a Gunnar Groth or that sort of situation. The Ferrier cigars don't make an appearance. And I thought it had some, a lot of different interesting scenes, like the shield generator bypass, and you get sort of the kidnapping attempt and all these other sort of intermediate plots that take us towards the final piece. And I also thought that it resolved a lot of the things that were brought up in the previous two books fairly well. It did kind of mean that it had to move really quickly in order to sort of, tie up all the loose ends as we approach the end there. But yeah, I think overall, it's funny you said you didn't remember anything from this one, because I think in my head, a lot of the stuff that happened in this book I thought was like the plot of Dark Force Rising. And then it turns out that like I remember the card rescue attempt, and that was the only thing I really remembered going in. And then all the stuff with, the asteroids and the shield I thought was like the plot of the second book. And then the third one was like the jungle, but all of that was packed in here. So, for the overall trilogy, I think I mentioned it before, but this is even more so, clearly the first EU set of books that came out. It really hit on a lot of the movie topics and sort of remixed a lot of the scenes. C'baoth was a pretty clear stand-in for the Emperor and Vader. And honestly, I mean, you asked about other Dark Jedi going forward. There's a surprising few that show up. Like here and there, you will see some sort of Dark Jedi character, but a lot of the books have, at most sort of a tangential connection to the Force, and there are Force elements, but we're not getting like a new Snoke showing up in every single trilogy. So I think because this was the first new story, they did want to keep it, somewhat familiar, and that's why we get C'baoth. But he's kind of unique compared to a lot of what we see in other books, even ones that have dark side users. They're not as just like blatantly, I'm a dark Jedi like he is. They also sort of, I feel like, had to hit all of the different aspects. So you have like the smugglers to represent your Mos Eisley sort of, grimy under society that the movies have, but then you also you have to feature the Imperials prominently. And as we go forward, people deviate a bit more. A lot of the concepts that are introduced here that weren't in the movies sort of carry forward to the other books, because this does serve as a template, though not everything sticks. like hot chocolate. Um, but
Niall's
it
cigar
does
smell.
Yeah, but it does set up a pretty difficult act to follow with Thrawn specifically. I think a lot of he's a pretty great villain, and still stands out even after everything that came after. So pretty tough act to follow.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And I think while this book served its purpose, or this trilogy served its purpose really well, it made me crave more standalone stories set in the Star Wars universe that are not beholden to the existing lore. And for all the reasons you said about Thrawn being a tough act to follow, it's like all the more reason I want stories that have basically nothing to do with what we just saw, right? Like you can only use that card so many times of like the Emperor's making a comeback, or the Empire's making a comeback, which is why I'm really excited to do the X-Wing series, because it's basically just a totally different set of characters and objectives. I wanted to talk for a second about Timothy Zahn as a writer, and I'm trying to find a way to word this that isn't like insulting. I think he's a little poorly suited for this kind of role, not because he's bad, but because he's kind of too good for it. He's really trying to make it more interesting and use these force powers in more interesting ways, which requires him to take liberties with them. And it does so at the expense of the movie canon. Like it kind of breaks a couple things. And so it is good that he's making it his own, and like the story works better in that way. But it does kind of drift into fan fiction territory in terms of how far he deviates. And so I think he needs kind of his own sandbox to play in that isn't beholden to these legacy characters. And like we said before, it sort of teeters back and forth between treating Jedi powers as like a mystical connection to all living things and this more like philosophical, spiritual thing, and versus video game powers for his big action set pieces. So I don't know how you felt about that, though.
Well, I guess maybe on that topic, the reason Zahn was chosen for this was because he was a pretty well-established sci-fi and fantasy writer and had written, multiple series and trilogies that were, his own universe. So he definitely had that opportunity there. I think in general, even if it does sort of break stuff from the movies and, kind of plays fast and loose with canon, I do like that approach more than being so locked into what came before. And I don't know, like the Abrams movies are just so beholden to everything, the original trilogy, and, just can't deviate at all. So I'd rather go in the opposite direction if you had to sort of pick one or the other.
Right.
We mentioned in the first episode that one of the things we wanted to talk about in this podcast was whether Disney should have just erased everything, and what exactly did we lose when Legends canon was removed. So I think we can maybe circle back to would this have worked as an adaptation and in sort of what form. So one option was that this trilogy, could it have been the actual sequel trilogy that people sometimes, refer to it as, say, rather than deciding to work on the prequels, Lucas had just decided to adapt this as the next three movies in like the late 80s.
Yeah, I think we're probably unanimous in saying no, not a chance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the story itself is not designed to be the follow-up to the original trilogy. I'll say what I think I said before, which is this is DLC for the original trilogy. It's like, if you like that, then you'll love the continuing adventures of Han, Luke, and Leia. But that's what it is. It's an extension of the original story.
Yeah, I think that maybe the more interesting question is, could this trilogy have been sort of incorporated into the new Disney canon? That the idea that Disney bought Star Wars and would have picked up where the current books were, like, that's a non-starter. Things go so crazy that just isn't feasible at all. But that isn't to say that they couldn't sort of pull a Halloween where, I don't know how familiar you are with the Halloween franchise, but they've rebooted multiple times, and they've chosen different cutoff points for where the new movies continue from. So there was like 1 through 6, I think, originally, and then they rebooted in the 90s or the early 2000s, and they only acknowledged the first 2, and then they had like a separate sequels. And then a few years ago, they rebooted again and only acknowledged the first movie. So there's
Right.
like 3 different timelines plus the Rob Zombie reboot. But, they could have either decided a cutoff point for the Legends canon or just sort of picked and chose things that they wanted to bring in. And I think that actually could have worked pretty well. Like, there's a world where instead of getting Rebels, we get an animated Heir to the Empire series or something like that. And I think that could have worked really well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, I'm still like very tentatively crossing my fingers that that's what we're going to get with Ahsoka season 2. I don't think we will, but like it sure would be cool if that happened. Because they're at exactly the right point in the timeline for it to sort of make sense. And I don't think it's a bad thing that they don't have, say, the original actors for Han, Luke, and Leia, or that they even necessarily need to be the key characters in it. I think it's totally fine if other characters sort of propagate or work their way through these events. Some of the C'baoth stuff would be hard without Jedi, without Luke, but definitely the Thrawn conflicts. I think you could use Mon Mothma. You could use some of the other Rebel characters. I guess they have Ahsoka. She could be the Jedi.
It's a shame there wasn't like a Bella Bliss sort of character in Andor that they could have brought back. Like, the closest is Luthen, and obviously he's not. Actually, maybe what's her name?
Oh,
Clea.
Clea. Yeah, I was gonna say Bail Organa, but yeah, that's not an option.
Yeah.
Clea type character. I mean, and that's the nice thing about this story is like if you needed to throw away Talon, Card, and Mara Jade, like there are plenty of other characters who could stand in for their role.
But yeah, if you wanted to do something with like Mon Mothma's sort of leadership post Bail Organa's death and sort of what that meant, especially after. I mean, I'm not sure I really want that because Andor was really good and I don't really trust anything else to handle it well. But
yeah,
we can dream. With regards to Zahn, I think I mentioned some of the other. He had done some other sci-fi series, but he also was pretty heavily involved in other Star Wars materials post this book. I think 14 total novels plus quite a few comic books and short stories and things like that. Most of them centered around either Thrawn or Mara in one way or another. He wrote 2 separate trilogies that are canon with Disney that sort of serve as Thrawn's official backstory. Though I think they're sort of, where they are in the timeline, you could kind of insert them as the Legends as well. He worked a lot with the X-Wing series author, Michael Stackpole. And so a lot of their characters sort of cross over between the books that they write, and they've also worked on comics and short stories together. And he also is a consultant, or he was a consultant on Ahsoka. I assume that he's going to be a consultant for whatever Thrawn-related stuff is happening in the future. And there's one short story that I want to highlight here. So Fate of the Jedi was the final storyline with the old Legends book. I think it was like 7 or 8 different novels, 3 authors sort of split the duties, and it was the last like major storyline they did. And after it finished, I think for an April Fool's joke, Zahn wrote a short story called Fate of the Jedi: An Apology, which is basically a Spider-Man clone saga sort of story where it turns out that way back on Wayland, because of all the confusion happening, Mara actually accidentally killed the real Luke Skywalker, and Luke Skywalker has been the one doing all the nonsense that sort of happens in Legends following that. And it sort of goes through a lot of the big events that had happened in the Legends and sort of gives it this, alternate perspective. And I think Thrawn also survives somehow, either as like a clone or, the Thrawn that was killed was a clone, and he's giving orders to Luke, but like he keeps messing up, and that's why the good guys keep winning and all this stuff. And it ends with him realizing, so Thrawn is also cloning all the other characters and replacing them, which is an explanation for why things maybe got off the rails. But it ends with there being a clone of Luke Skywalker named Luke Skywalker. And I think it kind of sounds like even he acknowledges that maybe all the clone stuff was a bit too much in this book. All right, so that brings us to our final point of discussion here, which is the Glup Shitto Award for the character that longtime fans would go crazy if they appeared in a new Disney property, but your casual fans would just be confused and would not understand why everybody was so excited. So we have quite a few people we could consider here, right?
Yeah, this book, I think, really focused more on background characters a lot more than the previous two. So we get a whole host of we get a whole host of smugglers, namely Samuel Thomas Gillespie. What a name.
He gets 3 names.
Yeah.
Mazik's just Mazik. Mazik doesn't even have a first, or I don't know if it's his first or last name.
Yeah. We get introduced to a bunch of new rebel commanders and leaders like Drayson, Bremen, Krill, Kraken, Pash Kraken, the son of Aaron Kraken, Varth, and Durlin. These are all very memorable characters who I'm sure we'll definitely remember the next time we see them. Ghent gets a bigger role. Winter's been in all 3 books. She deserves to be on the list. Luke with 2 U's, Luuk, and Morith Duel, who I wrote down because I had no idea if that was ever going to come back. Do any of these stand out to you?
I think it's got to be Luke Skywalker, just for the complete silliness of the name, trying to explain to somebody why Luke Skywalker is important, and that there's like a 10% chance this actually happens in The Mandalorian and Grogu, I think.
I mean, look, you gotta justify all the money they spent on those deep fakes. Yeah, I agree. I think also, like, when I think back to what I knew about this trilogy before rereading it, this was one of the only things, and he's only in the book for like a chapter, and then he dies, and then we never hear of him again. And I think that really personifies the purpose of this award, where it's so obscure and pointless to the overall thing, but it's just thrown in to please the fans.
Yeah. So to close out the trilogy, we're inducting Luke Skywalker into the Glup Shitto Hall of Fame. And I think this is probably the best example that we've had so far. So wrapping up here, as always, we're available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon. If anybody's listening and they request that we upload to Apple, I will happily upload to Apple. But until then, you can find us on Spotify and YouTube. And if anybody uses Amazon Music, you can find us there too. For the next episode, we're actually going to be rewinding a little bit in terms of the timeline and going back to the day after Return of the Jedi with the novel The Truce at Bakura, if you want to read that in advance. Going forward, I think it makes sense to just sort of follow a more timeline progression. We started with the Thrawn trilogy because it is sort of the most iconic and makes sense as an entry point. But the general plan is to go through the Bantam books, starting with The Truce at Bakura and then just going in timeline order. So any final comments here, Chris?
Well, I'm not super looking forward to the next handful of books. I'm pretty sure it's all downhill from here. This was a pretty great peak.
We got the weirdness of Truce at Bakura, but then it hits the X-Wing series, which are very good, and there's quite a lot of them, so we might need to take a break in between some of them just to change it up. But yeah, I think you'll appreciate the Truce at Bakura. If you wanted a story that was diverging from the original trilogy, I think you're gonna get it here.
I should be careful what I ask for.
All right, so that brings this episode to a close. I hope you found that it was done so artfully, and we'll see you next time.